The fire took everything. In the span of a single night, what had once been a home full of warmth and memory turned to blackened wood, melted glass, and silence. Grace, a quiet, resilient mother, stood barefoot on the sidewalk, holding her son's trembling hand, her golden retriever pressed to her side. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just stared, not at the lost furniture or the ruined kitchen, but at one thing. A framed Matrix poster signed by the cast, gifted long ago by her brother, still visible through the front window. A second later, it caught flame and vanished. She didn't ask for donations. She didn't post a GoFundMe. But later that night, in the stillness of a borrowed couch, she whispered into the dark, "I just wish I still had my Matrix poster. That thing saw me through a lot." She wrote those words online, not for attention, just to let it out. No hashtags, no tags, just the truth. And somewhere, in a film trailer miles away, Keanu Reeves read them. He didn't comment, he didn't repost, but he did something else. Something quiet, something unforgettable. What happens when a quiet grief meets a quiet kindness from someone who once wore black leather and saved the world on screen? Let's find out. Grace Marino had never needed much to be happy. Her house wasn't big, and it certainly wasn't fancy, but it was home. A one-story bungalow at the edge of a quiet street in Silver Pines, with chipped blue siding, a crooked mailbox, and wind chimes on the porch made from old spoons her son Eli had strung together when he was 9. Inside, every inch told a story. Stacked books from second-hand shops, a leaning coffee table with one leg propped up by a coaster, and a gallery wall of old family photos faded from sun and time. But the centerpiece, the heart of the house, was a framed Matrix poster above the TV. A 1999 original, signed by the entire cast, gifted to her by her late brother. Grace never took it down. He had told her once, "You're just like Neo, quiet, stubborn, and you don't back down." And when life pushed her to the edge, when rent was late or the fridge was nearly empty, that poster reminded her that survival could be silent, that strength didn't have to shout. Grace and Eli lived a quiet rhythm. He was 16, bright and observant, always half lost in books or sketching in his worn-out notebook. Their dog Bingo, a golden retriever with more energy than manners, patrolled the small yard like he owned the block. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. That night, dinner was leftover enchiladas. Eli was at the kitchen table, headphones in, finishing a homework quiz. Grace stood by the sink, folding laundry and half watching the local news. The sky outside had gone an odd, bruised gray, and the wind had picked up, sharp and dry. Then came the sound. A pop, distant but violent, like bones breaking. The transformer down the block exploded. Lights flickered once, twice, then the entire street went dark. Grace didn't panic. She grabbed the flashlight and called out to Eli. "Stay put," she said, her voice steady. Bingo was already pacing, restless, alert. She stepped onto the porch, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. That's when she saw it. A small fire near the base of a utility pole 2 houses down. Flames licked up the dry grass like it had been waiting for this moment, and the wind, cruel, fast, turned that spark into a wave of flame in seconds. She ran back inside. "Eli, get your shoes, we're going, now!" He didn't ask questions. He had never seen his mother like that. Fierce, focused, frightened, but in control. Grace grabbed her coat, shoved Bingo's leash into her pocket. She didn't think about her purse, not the photo albums, not even the poster, just Eli, just the dog, just getting out. By the time they reached the sidewalk, the fire was already roaring. Neighbors were pouring out of their homes in robes and slippers, pointing, yelling. Someone tried to fight the flames with a garden hose. Someone else screamed that the fire trucks were on the way. But Grace knew the fire had already won. She stood there in the street, one arm around Eli, the other gripping Bingo's leash, barefoot and blinking through the smoke. And then she saw it, through the front window, the poster still hanging on the wall. The last piece of her old world, framed and glowing in the fire's reflection. Then the glass shattered and the flames swallowed it whole. She turned Eli's head away. By the time the firefighters arrived, it was too late. Her home, her memories, everything was gone. The fire tore through half the block. 3 other homes were partially damaged. But Grace's? It burned straight to the foundation. The next morning, the air still tasted like ash. Her house was a blackened skeleton. All that remained was the charred outline of what used to be a life. But the mailbox, crooked and scorched, still stood. She stared at it for a long time, and for the first time since the fire started, Grace let herself cry. The shelter they stayed in that night wasn't far, just down the road in a neighbor's spare room. Grace lay on a borrowed couch, arms wrapped protectively around her son, Bingo curled at their feet like a silent sentinel. The house was warm, the lights dim, the air filled with a quiet sympathy, but Grace couldn't sleep. Eli had cried once earlier when they'd walked away from the smoking ruins of their home. Now, he just stared at the ceiling in silence. "Are we going to be okay?" he asked softly. Grace reached for his hand. "We will," she whispered. "We've been through worse. We'll figure it out. Not for the first time. Not for the last." But in the dark, she was still grieving something no insurance could replace. The next morning, she returned to what used to be their front yard. Everything was gone. The living room where they watched movies, the kitchen where she taught Eli to crack eggs, the hallway where Bingo used to slide into walls chasing tennis balls. All of it had turned to ash. Grace crouched by what remained of the porch. The air still held the acrid bite of smoke. She reached into the rubble and pulled out a half-melted spoon, her grandmother's. The metal was warped, blackened, but she held it like it was gold. Neighbors came by, quiet and wide-eyed, offering food, clothes, even hugs. One woman brought her socks, another slipped her a $20 bill. And then came the Red Cross volunteer, a young woman with a clipboard and gentle voice. "If there's anything you lost that you'd want us to try and replace," she asked. "Something sentimental, something personal. Anything at all?" Grace stared at the blank notepad the woman held out. The pen trembled in her hand. She thought of the poster. It sounded ridiculous. With all that she had lost, the house, the furniture, even her family photos, how could she explain that what hurt the most was a piece of movie memorabilia? But it wasn't just a poster. She tapped the pen once, then twice, and finally wrote, "I just wish I still had my Matrix poster." The volunteer tilted her head. "Your Matrix poster?" Grace smiled sheepishly. "It saw me through a lot," she said quietly. "My brother gave it to me. He's gone now. That poster was the last thing he ever gave me. It reminded me that I could survive." That night, she posted a photo of the ruins on her social media account. No hashtags, no calls for help, just a caption. "We lost everything, but weirdly, the thing I miss most is my Matrix poster. That thing saw me through a lot." She didn't expect anything, but people saw it. Friends shared it. Strangers commented. Some said they had Matrix posters they'd be happy to send. Others just left hearts and words like, "We see you, we remember, we understand." It wasn't pity, it was connection. And Grace, wrapped in a borrowed blanket with Bingo asleep by her side, scrolled through every comment. For the first time in days, she didn't feel invisible. The next morning, a local news station reached out for an interview. She declined. She didn't want cameras in her face, didn't want a spotlight. What she wanted, what she missed, was the feeling that something she'd lost had mattered, that someone, somewhere, understood. Eli sat beside her on the porch later that day, staring into the distance. "So what now?" Grace exhaled slowly. "I don't know," she said, looking at the scorched remains of their block. "But we're still here, and that has to be enough for now." For days, they lived in limbo. Eli tried to focus on schoolwork using a borrowed tablet. Grace helped sweep ash from the sidewalk in front of the wreckage. People kept stopping by with casseroles and blankets, but she still felt the absence of something. Then Eli said it. "You should post the picture, Mom." She looked up from her coffee mug. "What picture?" "The one you took, with the mailbox. You said it made you feel something. Maybe it would help someone else." She hesitated. Grace had never been one to share deeply online, but his eyes held a quiet plea, not for attention, but for healing. That afternoon, under the awning of Rose's porch, Grace uploaded the photo. A blackened mailbox, a shell of a home. The caption simple: "I don't need charity. I just wish I still had my Matrix poster. That thing saw me through a lot." She turned off her phone and didn't check it again for hours. But something was already moving. That night, while Grace dozed on the couch with a blanket over her legs and bingo at her feet, something began to ripple. The post didn't go viral in the explosive, overnight way people imagine. It moved differently, quietly, steadily, like embers catching wind. By morning, her phone buzzed with over 100 notifications. No one was offering money. No one was asking for interviews. They were offering something else: recognition. One comment read, "I lost my dad in 2000. The Matrix was the first thing that made me believe I could keep going." Another, that line, "I just wish I still had my Matrix poster." That's how grief talks. Not loud, just honest. Grace sat on the edge of Rose's porch, staring at her phone in disbelief. It was like people saw past the fire, past the ash, straight into her heart. And then came the message. A woman named Naya from Michigan. Her husband had passed years ago. She and he had watched The Matrix on their first date. "I've had a signed poster in storage for years. It's not perfect, but I think he'd want you to have it." Grace didn't know what to say. She typed slowly, deliberately. "Thank you, I'll keep it safe." Later that day, a news producer called. The story was making its way through local circles now. Grace declined, again. Firm but kind. "I'm not looking for attention," she said. "This wasn't a campaign, it was just a moment I told the truth." The producer respected her wish, but asked if they could share her quote. Grace hesitated, then said yes. If it helps someone else feel less alone, it's okay. That evening, during the news segment, a quiet voice read her words over the image of the scorched house. "I don't need charity, I just wish I still had my Matrix poster." No music, no dramatic lighting, just truth. Eli watched the segment in silence. When it ended, he turned to his mom. "You said the smallest thing, and look what happened." Grace smiled, her eyes misty. "I didn't try to make anything happen," she said softly. "I just missed something that mattered." By the weekend, things had shifted. Again, people online began reposting her photo with new captions. Grief doesn't ask for replacements, it asks to be remembered. Dozens of others added their voices in the comments. "My apartment burned down when I was in college. I didn't miss the laptop. I missed the mixtape my dad made me when I was 10. I lost my dad last year, and sometimes I miss his favorite mug more than anything else." Grace read every single one, not because she needed to, but because she understood, and because they saw her. In one reply, someone simply wrote, "Thank you for reminding us that what we miss matters." She didn't cry this time. She just closed her eyes and sat still. And far away in a trailer on a movie set, someone else was scrolling. Keanu Reeves sat between takes, sipping lukewarm tea, flipping through his feed without thinking. Then he saw it. At first, just an image, a house burned to ash with a lone mailbox standing. Then the caption, "I don't need charity. I just wish I still had my Matrix poster. That thing saw me through a lot." He stopped. He read it again and again. It wasn't the poster that hit him, it was the grief in the simplicity, the stillness in the way she said it, the honesty. He scrolled through the comments, the reposts, the stories people had left beneath hers. Keanu leaned back, the phone still in his hand. He didn't know Grace, but he understood her. Not as a celebrity, not as Neo, but as someone who had loved and lost and held on to little things that held big meanings. He sent a single message to his assistant. "Can you find the woman who posted this?" No fanfare, no campaign, no cameras. Just one quiet decision. The next day, Keanu made another call. It was to a friend who worked in rare movie memorabilia. "Do you still have that original Matrix poster from Comic-Con '99? The voice on the other end paused. "The one signed by the whole cast? Yeah, it's in mint condition. Why?" Keanu didn't explain. He didn't need to. "I need it by tomorrow." The morning air in Santa Clarita carried a strange calm, as if even the wind was waiting for something. Grace stood at what remained of her front yard, picking through soot and debris. She found a cracked mug, a melted spoon, and a photo frame with nothing inside. Her hands were blackened, her spirit a quiet ache. She didn't know the world had seen her. That across the country someone had seen more than just her post. He had seen her heart. And he was already on his way. Before sunrise, in a quiet memorabilia shop in North Hollywood, Keanu Reeves stood in front of a felt-lined table. In front of him lay a perfectly preserved Matrix poster, signed by the original cast. He traced the ink with his eyes. Carrie and Moss, Lawrence Fishburne, the Wachowskis, and his own name, still silver after all these years. To most, it was a collector's item. To him, in this moment, it was something else. A key, a thread, a bridge between a burned-down life and something worth remembering. "It's more than a film to her," Keanu said softly. The shop owner didn't ask why. He simply nodded and helped reframe the poster. Keanu paid in cash, no discounts, no questions. An hour later, he drove alone, heading north, the poster seatbelted beside him as if it too was a passenger on a sacred mission. No PR team, no assistants. Just Keanu, and the memory of a woman who had whispered something into the void, and somehow it had reached him. Grace didn't hear the car pull up. She was sorting through a donated box of socks and canned food with her neighbor Rosa and her son Eli. Bingo lay under the shade, his head resting on a folded towel. Then came the sound of footsteps, not hurried, not loud. Grace looked up. A man in jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and a cap stood at the edge of her temporary yard. He held a framed object in his hands, wrapped gently in cloth. She blinked, shielding her eyes from the sun. He smiled. "Hi," he said. "I heard you missed something." Grace froze. The voice, calm, grounded. The face, familiar in a way that didn't feel real. She stepped forward slowly. "Are you?" He gave a small nod. "I'm Keanu, and I think this belongs to you." He lifted the frame, and there it was. The Matrix poster, signed, real. Grace's knees buckled slightly. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. It wasn't just a poster. It was her brother's memory, her late nights of strength, her reason to keep going when life felt too heavy. And now it was back. Her eyes filled, but no words came, only tears. Quiet, honest tears. Keanu didn't fill the silence. He just stood beside her gently. After a long moment, she whispered, "Why? Why would you come all this way?" His answer was simple. "Because you didn't ask for anything, and that made me want to give more." Eli stood nearby, eyes wide. "You're really him?" Keanu crouched slightly to meet his gaze. "Sometimes," he said, smiling, "but right now, I'm just the guy with the poster." They invited him in, not as a celebrity, not as a guest of honor, but as someone who had shown up. Inside Rosa's home, they placed the poster gently on the coffee table. Eli traced the glass with a reverence usually reserved for relics. Grace stared at the signature, the same one her brother had once stood in line to get. It felt impossible, yet here it was, and here he was. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. "I know," Keanu replied, "but some things are worth doing anyway." Rosa peeked in, stunned. "Is that?" Keanu stood and offered his hand, still humble, still grounded. "Hi, I'm Keanu." For the next hour, they talked. No cameras, no script. Keanu asked about Eli's school, about Grace's garden that had burned, about the dog, Bingo, who climbed into his lap without hesitation. They laughed softly, cried without shame. He listened, not like a man used to being interviewed, but like someone who wanted to understand. Before leaving, Keanu reached into his coat and handed Grace an envelope. "No logos," he said. "No press. Just a contact. Someone who helps people rebuild, quietly." Inside was a handwritten note, a name, a phone number, and one line. "Use this however you need." She didn't ask how much, she didn't need to. It wasn't about the money. It was about the meaning. "You don't even know me," she said. Keanu smiled, eyes steady. "I don't have to," he said. "I saw enough." Then he stood, nodded at Eli, and turned toward the door. Bingo followed him, tail wagging. And just before he stepped out, Keanu turned back one last time. "I'm glad the poster found its way home." Grace clutched it to her chest. "It did more than that," she said, voice breaking. "It brought part of me back, too." The next morning, Grace stood at her window, coffee in hand, staring at the framed poster now resting on a shelf in the living room. The house they were staying in wasn't theirs, but that one thing, that poster, made it feel like home again. Eli was still asleep on the couch. Bingo snored softly at his feet. The morning light filtered through the curtains like a blessing. Grace didn't post about Keanu's visit, not on social media, not to friends, not even in passing. Some moments were too sacred to share. But kindness has a way of moving, with or without words. Later that week, Rosa walked up with a newspaper in hand. "You're not going to believe this," she said, waving it slightly. Grace glanced at the front page. There it was. Not Keanu's face, not her photo, just a small, quiet headline. She didn't ask for charity, she got something better. Below it, a still image of her burned-out home and a quote, "I just wish I still had my Matrix poster. That thing saw me through a lot." No names, no sensationalism. Just truth. "I didn't even talk to them," Grace whispered. Rosa smiled. That's the thing. The story told itself. By the end of the week, something strange started happening on Vista Court. A white truck pulled up with no company logo. Two men in work boots stepped out and started unloading plywood. "Are you at the city?" one neighbor asked. "No, ma'am," one of the men replied, smiling. "We're with the Quiet Hands Project. Got a list of houses that need a second chance." Ray stood on her porch in disbelief. "I didn't apply for anything," she said quietly. The man nodded. "Someone applied for you." No one said Keanu's name. No one needed to. The next morning, more trucks arrived, one with roofing supplies, another with insulation, a third towing a mobile tool shed. No cameras, no press, just quiet footsteps, focused hands. And everywhere, kindness. Mr. Jenkins, the elderly neighbor 2 doors down, shuffled onto his porch with a cane and squinted at the crew replacing his railings. "I can pitch in," he called. One of the younger workers grinned. "You just sit back and supervise, sir. We've got you." Down the block, a mother wept as a new door was installed on her home, the same door that had once been burned to ash. And across the street, Eli helped a neighbor's daughter draw chalk flowers on the sidewalk. Grace stood at the edge of it all, holding the framed poster, watching it ripple. Not a favor, not a rescue, but a message. You mattered enough to be seen. The repairs continued day after day. Houses once stripped by fire were now clothed in new siding, new shingles, new color. One neighbor painted a wooden sign and nailed it above the new community garden fence. Vista strong, est. Now. Grace didn't speak much, but she smiled more. She found herself doing small things again, sweeping porches, making lemonade, offering sandwiches to the workers. It wasn't a return to normal. It was the building of something new, something better. Then came the envelope. No return address, no stamp. Just her name, handwritten. Inside, a check, real, made out to the neighborhood association. $75,000, 0 cents. And a note, no signature, just one line. "For the street that stood together." Wraith didn't cry when she saw it. She just closed her eyes and whispered, "You didn't have to." But somewhere in her heart, she heard the answer. "I did it anyway." She placed the envelope next to the poster. Not to frame it, to honor it. By the following week, people who had once passed each other without a word were swapping garden tools and recipes. Kids painted the rebuilt fences with flowers and foxes. A small chalk mural appeared in front of Grace's house. In the center, in block letters, "We were seen." One afternoon, Eli stood in front of it and added something of his own. He drew a small fox in blue chalk. Just below it, he wrote, "Some heroes leave capes, ours left a fox." Grace didn't ask him why. She just hugged him. And far away, in a room lit only by morning sun, Keanu Reeves opened a package from Santa Clarita. Inside, a photo of Grace's rebuilt home. In the frame, the Matrix poster. Below it, the little carved wooden fox. He stared at the photo for a long time, then carefully placed it in a small wooden box beside other quiet treasures. Not to keep, to remember. Because he knew this story wasn't about him. It was about what happens after the fire. About what happens when kindness doesn't come with a name. When belief doesn't need to be loud. When a knock on the door becomes the sound that starts it all. Spring came early to Vista Court. Not with fanfare, not with celebration. Just with the quiet certainty of growth. Grass pushing through scorched soil. Buds blooming on trees that had once stood black and bare. The homes were almost all repaired now. Fresh siding, clean windows, new doors painted in colors the residents got to choose. But the real change, it wasn't the houses. It was the people inside them. One morning, Grace walked down the block carrying 2 cups of coffee, one for herself and one for Mr. Jenkins. His new porch had a chair waiting for her. "Smells like rain," he said, lifting his mug. Grace nodded. "Smells like a new start." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Rosa and a few others plant rosemary and marigolds along the park fence. It had become a ritual, hands in the dirt, laughter in the air. "We're still here," Jenkins said after a while. And that meant something. In the center of the neighborhood stood the new community bench, repainted in soft gray, surrounded by handmade flower pots and a tiny lending library built from salvaged wood. Above the bench, carved into a wooden plaque, "For the stranger who showed up and everyone who stayed." Children played under the oak tree that had somehow survived the fire. It stood like a guardian now, roots deep, branches stretched wide. Some days Grace would sit beneath it with Eli. They didn't talk much about the fire anymore. Not because they'd forgotten, but because the pain had finally made room for something else. Hope. One afternoon, a delivery arrived. A large canvas, wrapped and protected. No label, no invoice. Grace opened it slowly, expecting supplies or perhaps a donation. But inside was something entirely different. A painting, childlike in style but powerful. It showed the block in full color. Homes rebuilt, families smiling, the fox statue nestled above a door. In the sky above, words were scrawled in bold white paint. "Kindness grew here." She turned it over. No name, no signature. Just a small note tucked behind the frame. "Keep passing it on." She didn't know who sent it, but she knew why. By mid-April, the neighborhood felt more alive than ever. There were movie nights on the lawn, potlucks with folding tables lined up between mailboxes. Kids set up lemonade stands to raise money for a new mural on the school fence. One morning, Eli approached Grace with a question. "Do you think we could plant something?" She looked at him, curious. "Plant what?" "I don't know, just something that wasn't here before, something that's ours." That weekend, they picked up a small sapling, a flowering dogwood, and planted it at the edge of their new front yard. Grace wrote a note on a rock and placed it at its base. "From ashes we bloom." The next day, something unexpected happened. The same truck that once brought the crews for repairs returned. This time, the men inside weren't carrying shingles or tools. They were carrying bookshelves, art supplies, a box labeled simply letters. Grace watched them from the porch, puzzled. "I thought everything was done." One of the men smiled. "This isn't repairs anymore, it's legacy." He handed her a folder. Inside were notes from people across the country, teachers, veterans, fire survivors, even a young girl from Ohio who had written, "I heard about the woman who missed her poster. It made me think of my teddy bear. It burned in a fire last year. I didn't tell anyone. Until now." Grace placed a hand to her mouth. These were more than messages. They were echoes. Later that week, Eli walked into the kitchen holding a letter in his hands. "Mon, I want to write back." She smiled. "Then let's get some paper." They sat together, writing replies to the ones that touched them most. Grace's handwriting was small and neat. Eli's was big and looping, the letters dancing off the lines. They didn't send advice. They just shared what they'd learned. That grief doesn't have to roar. That asking for nothing sometimes opens the door to everything. That showing up quietly can change a life. That summer, a new girl moved into the neighborhood. Her family had lost their home in a flood across the state and relocated here. She was shy, kept her head down. Until one afternoon, she noticed the little fox statue on Grace's porch. "What's that?" she asked. Grace smiled. "A gift from someone who saw us when the world didn't." The girl blinked. "Do you think he'll see us too?" Eli stepped beside her and pointed toward the oak tree, the painted bench, and the chalk mural that was now permanent. "It already does," he said. That night, Grace wrote a letter she never intended to send. It began with one line. "You didn't have to knock, but I'm so glad you did." She folded it and tucked it behind the frame of the Matrix poster. Not for anyone else, just to remind herself what had started it all, and what had grown since. The new school year had just begun. The sun cast a golden hue over Vista Court, and the air had that unmistakable mix of late summer and new beginnings. Eli sat at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, tapping the eraser thoughtfully. A scholarship application sat in front of him, blank except for the question at the top. "Describe a moment that changed your life." He stared at it for a while, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he had too many. The fire, the poster, the knock at the door, the quiet rebuilding. After a deep breath, he began to write. "My name is Eli Moreno. I used to think the scariest part of life was losing everything. Then I watched my mom rebuild it, not with money, but with kindness. One cup of borrowed sugar and one sidewalk chalk drawing at a time." His words came quickly, but each one landed with weight. "I remember the night it all burned, the heat, the noise, the feeling that nothing would ever be okay again. And I remember the silence afterward. I remember the morning someone knocked on our door, not a firefighter, not a government official, but Keanu Reeves, with a rolled-up poster under his arm and kindness in his eyes. He didn't come to fix us, he came to sit with us, and sometimes that's enough." He wrote about what came next, the rebuilding crews, the painted fences, the garden blooming where ashes once settled. He didn't name Keanu outright. It wasn't about him, it was about what he represented. Some people think heroes wear capes. I think they sit on porches and listen. I think they help you believe again without needing applause. When he finished, Eli folded the letter and slipped it into the envelope, one addressed to the scholarship board. Then he printed a second copy. This one he placed in another envelope, no return address, just a name on the front. Keanu. He hesitated for a moment, then smiled. He didn't know where it would go. He didn't even know if it would arrive. But he knew it had to be sent. Weeks passed. And then, one quiet morning in a studio apartment overlooking downtown Los Angeles, Keanu opened his mail. It was late, the sun hadn't fully risen. A warm cup of tea sat forgotten on the windowsill. He read the letter slowly as if it were something delicate. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. When he reached the final lines, he leaned back in his chair, folding the page neatly. "You didn't save us. You reminded us we didn't need to be saved to matter." He placed the letter in a small wooden box beside a photo of his sister, a worn-out music cassette, and the fox carving from Vista Court. He didn't call anyone, didn't send a reply. He just sat there, quietly, letting it echo. Back in Santa Clarita, the neighborhood continued to bloom. The kids were now painting their second mural. The garden had expanded with help from a nonprofit. The lending library overflowed with donated books. One morning, Grace stepped outside to water the basil when she noticed an envelope on the doormat. No name, no address, just one sentence handwritten in soft ink. Hope takes root where someone believes. Inside, a small carved bookmark, a fox etched delicately in oak. She didn't need to guess where it came from. That weekend, the neighborhood gathered for their first official block festival. There were tables of food, live music from someone's uncle with a guitar, and a community art wall where kids could draw anything they wanted. Eli drew a tree, strong roots, full canopy. And under it, a boy handing a poster to a woman with tears in her eyes. One of the younger kids asked, "Is that your mom?" Eli smiled. "Yeah, that's the day she got her hope back." Grace placed her arm gently around his shoulder, and just a few feet away, the fox statue watched from its perch on the porch. Still, silent, steady, like the memory of a man who had knocked once and never really left. The sun hung low over Sunny Hill Park, casting long shadows and bathing everything in soft amber light. The newly planted oak tree stood tall now, its leaves fuller, its roots digging deeper with each passing day. Around its base, the earth had been cleared and shaped with care. A new bench, sanded, painted, and placed with quiet intention, now sat beneath its branches. On the bench was a small engraved plaque. It didn't mention names or dates or events. It simply read, "For the stranger who showed up, and everyone who stayed." That weekend, the neighborhood gathered. There was no special invitation, no flyers, no announcements. But word spread the way important things do, gently and only to those who needed to hear. Grace arrived first with a thermos of tea and 2 mismatched cups. Eli followed close behind, holding a laminated copy of the first mural the kids had painted after the fire. Mr. Jenkins, cane in hand, took his usual place under the tree with a nod to the plaque. "Still here," he muttered, to no one in particular. The kids came too, Evie, Micah, twins from the corner house, all with arms full of chalk. They knelt near the sidewalk and began to draw again. Arts, trees, a skyline of tiny homes, and always, always, the fox. No one told them what to draw, but they knew. That afternoon, Grace read a letter aloud to the circle gathered around the bench. It was the same letter Eli had written, his scholarship essay, now laminated and hung in the community bulletin box beside the oak. She read slowly, her voice catching on the parts that still ached. "My mom didn't just survive a fire. She taught me how to live after it." When she finished, the group was silent for a moment. Then Mr. Jenkins raised his paper cup in a quiet toast. "To the ones who stay, to the ones who see." The rest followed, not loud, not formal, just hands lifted with quiet gratitude. A few days later, a woman arrived at the park, new to town, her hands calloused, her expression cautious. She didn't say much, just sat on the bench and looked at the fox carving nestled under the tree. Eli saw her. He didn't approach, just walked to the bulletin board and added something new, a sticky note in bold black ink. "Whatever brought you here, you're not alone." By sunset, there were 10 more notes added. "This tree listens. You don't have to speak to be seen. We've been where you are." It became something unplanned, a wall of whispers, of kindness that didn't demand attention, just presence. One morning, Grace found another small box at her doorstep. Inside, a photograph of the fox statue on her porch, beautifully framed, and a single line on the back. "Heard your story traveled. Just wanted to say it helped mine too." No name, no signature, but she knew. She added it to the growing collection on their hallway shelf, Letters from strangers, Polaroids from visitors, one carefully folded drawing from a child in another state who had seen Eli's story in a classroom slideshow. And beside all of it, the framed Matrix poster, now surrounded by stories not of movies, but of movement, of healing. That fall, a new family moved in 2 doors down, young parents, a toddler, a lot of exhaustion in their eyes. Grace brought soup. Eli brought sidewalk chalk. On their porch, Evie drew a tiny fox with a heart above it. And in the window, just beside the curtains, the parents placed a sticky note. "We're starting over. Thank you for letting us begin." Late one evening, as the neighborhood lights dimmed and only porch glows remained, Eli stepped outside. He walked to the tree, barefoot, hoodie wrapped tight, and placed a folded letter under the fox carving. Inside, just one line. "Some fires take homes, but some awaken something bigger." He didn't need to know if it would be read. He just needed to leave it there. Far away, in a quiet room where the walls were lined with books and warm light filtered in through tall windows, Keanu Reeves stood beside a shelf. He reached for the wooden box again, the one that held letters, tokens, and pieces of a life he never asked to shape, but was grateful to witness. He opened it slowly, added one more photo, the tree, the chalk, the note wall, then closed the lid. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and he whispered to no one. They were never broken, just waiting to remember who they were. The sky over Sunny Hill Park had turned a soft violet as the last golden lines of sun disappeared behind the hills. The oak tree stood quietly now, its branches stretching like arms, its leaves fluttering with every breeze as if waving gently to those who passed. On the bench beneath it, a child sat cross-legged, reading a dog-eared book. Her younger brother dozed beside her, head resting on her shoulder. Near their feet, the fox carving remained nestled in the grass, still unmarked, still silent, but never unnoticed. The neighborhood had changed, not by noise, not by fame, but by touch, quiet touches that lingered long after the hands that made them had moved on. But a fresh coat of paint on a fence, new shutters on old homes, chalk drawings renewed after every rain. The lending library at the corner stayed stocked. Kids swapped stories like secrets. Adults took what they needed and left what they could. Some left paperbacks, others left notes. One day, someone tucked in a small folded card between the pages of The Little Prince. In tidy handwriting, it read, "You helped me believe again. That was enough." It wasn't signed, but no one expected it to be. Inside Grace's home, the one that had once been ash and rubble, the lights were warm and steady. A pot of lentil soup simmered on the stove. Her son Eli sat at the table, now a teenager with taller shoulders and quieter eyes, writing another letter, this time for someone who had lost their home in a nearby town. He'd never met them, but he wrote it anyway. "It's okay if you don't know what to say. Sometimes silence is enough if you let people sit in it with you." Grace passed by him, brushing a hand over his shoulder without a word. On the mantel above the fireplace, the framed Matrix poster still stood, protected, cherished. But around it now were new things. Photos of neighbors helping neighbors. A photo of the tree with dozens of chalk hearts at its base. A quote someone had scrawled on the park bench in permanent ink. "Some heroes whisper." Across town, an anonymous donation quietly funded the expansion of the resource van. Now there were 3, traveling weekly to areas hit by disaster, run by volunteers who had once been helped themselves. The vans had no logos, no slogans, just one simple emblem painted near the back wheel, a fox curled beside a book beneath an oak tree. Far away, Keanu Reeves sat at a desk in his home. The room was quiet. On the wall hung a framed photo, a child's sidewalk chalk mural. He hadn't commissioned it, he hadn't even asked for it, but it had been mailed to him in a plain envelope with no return address, just 5 small words. "You gave us back light." He stared at the photo for a long time, then turned to the wooden box on his shelf. Inside it now were tokens that had nothing to do with movies. A marble from a girl named Zoe, a folded school essay signed Eli a drawing of a dinner table with 3 chairs, a single Polaroid with the words, "Home, stronger than fire." He closed the lid slowly and whispered, "Sometimes showing up is the only magic people ever needed." Back in Sunny Hill Park, the oak tree bloomed again the following spring. Children played beneath it, teens leaned against its trunk and shared headphones. Adults took turns planting bulbs in the flower beds nearby. On the anniversary of the fire, no speeches were given. No cameras arrived. But at dawn, someone, no one ever knew who, placed a small candle beneath the fox carving. The wind didn't blow it out. It burned all the way to sunrise. That evening, Eli and Grace sat on their porch, the sky turning that same honey gold it had the night Keanu first knocked on their door. Grace looked out at the street. It didn't look new anymore. It looked lived in, better than before, not despite the fire, but because of what rose from it. Eli turned toward her. "Do you ever think about him?" She nodded. "I don't have to wonder where he is. I think he's everywhere people show up without being asked." They sat for a long time in silence, the kind that held more than words ever could. And on a quiet road somewhere, as headlights stretch across asphalt and the sky blurs between twilight and memory, a man drives alone, no destination on paper, but every place in his heart. He passes towns that don't know they were seen. He remembers faces that never asked for help, only for kindness. And he carries something not just in his hands, but in the way he moves through the world. A willingness to show up, to listen, to remind the forgotten that they matter, without ever needing to say it out loud.